dim lights of the bar flickered as the hum of low conversation filled the room. It wasn't much different from any other night at this out-of-the-way dive, except for the one unusual thing. The woman sitting alone at the corner table. Her striking features, the delicate angles of her face, the shimmer of her violet eyes. She was not from around here, not from this world. But, for now, she looked just like anyone else, quietly sipping her drink, observing the strange customs of the humans around her. She had come to Earth, not out of curiosity, but as part of a mission study. The humans understand their behaviors and return. Simple enough. Yet, something had shifted in her the moment her eyes met his. He wasn't anything extraordinary. Just a man, leaning against the bar, casually chatting with the bartender about something unimportant. His easy smile, his laugh that came from somewhere deep inside, the way he carried himself no different from the others. But to her, he was magnetic. There was something about him that stirred something inside her, something she hadn't anticipated. It had started with just a passing glance, her eyes locking with his. He smiled, a friendly gesture that didn't carry the weight of anything deeper. She should have looked away, should have maintained her distance. But she couldn't. Her heart, a foreign concept she never truly understood, began to race. She had never felt anything like this before. The pulse of attraction, the strange yearning, the warmth in her chest. Was this love? She didn't know. Love was not something she had ever studied, never something she had been taught to expect or understand. Curiosity had always been her driving force, but this was something else. She felt pulled toward him, almost against her will. Without thinking, she stood up and made her way across the room, the sound of her footsteps muted against the low background noise. As she approached him, he turned his head slightly, giving her that same easy smile, like she was just another friendly face in the crowd. "Hey there," he said, his voice light, but with an edge of something she couldn't place. She faltered for a second, unsure of what to say, but the warmth spreading in her chest gave her courage. "Hi," she replied, her voice more delicate than she intended. "First time in here?" he asked, motioning to the bar around them. "I haven't seen you before." She nodded, unsure of how to explain that she wasn't truly from around here, that she had never been to Earth before. "Yes. I'm new." Her words felt strange on her tongue, but they seemed to work. He didn't ask more questions, just smiled. "Well, you're welcome to join me," he said, gesturing to the empty seat beside him. She hesitated for a moment, but then sat, the heat in her chest growing stronger with every passing second. They talked about small things at first, the weather, how different Earth was from other planets she had visited, how she had learned to adjust to human customs. He listened intently, and every time their eyes met, it was like something unspoken passed between them, something that neither of them fully understood. But then, she asked him, "What is it that makes humans fall in love?" He paused, his eyes narrowing just slightly, as if considering the question seriously. "I guess it's a little bit of everything. You meet someone, and something clicks. You can't explain it, but you feel it. Something makes you want to be with them, to protect them, to care for them." Her heart raced again, this time in a way that made her feel exposed. Could this be what she was experiencing? Could she be falling in love with him? Before she could ask herself another question, she realized she was already too deep into the feeling. But as the night went on, something unexpected happened. He glanced over her shoulder, his face suddenly becoming distant. "Sorry, I think I've got to head out." She blinked, unsure of how to process the sudden shift. "Wait." He gave her a half smile, a shrug of apology. "I'll see you around." And with that, he walked away. She watched him disappear into the crowd, the warmth inside her now replaced with a quiet confusion. Something had changed. Something was different, and now she was left with only one question. She stayed there, sitting alone at the bar, feeling the quiet hum of the world around her. The bartender gave her a quick glance, wiping the counter with a rag, but didn't interrupt her thoughts. She didn't even hear the music playing anymore. Her mind was racing, running in circles as she tried to understand what had just happened. Her hand still gripped the cold, half-finished drink in front of her, though she had lost any interest in it. What had she just experienced? The sensation of something so alien, yet so familiar, settling deep in her chest. It was a feeling she hadn't known she was capable of. Was it truly love? Could that really be what this was? Her training had never prepared her for this. She had studied human emotions, at least. That's what she had been told to do, but those were just data points, abstract ideas written down on a screen. She had learned to recognize the patterns, the signs, the actions that accompanied human interactions. But this was something different. Something that didn't fit into any of the categories she had learned. The attraction was strong, yes, but it felt almost involuntary. She hadn't meant to feel this way. She wasn't supposed to feel this way. She couldn't shake the image of his face from her mind, the warmth of his smile, the glimmer of interest in his eyes. It was unsettling, and as much as she tried to push it away, the thought of him lingered, a constant undercurrent to everything else around her. His simple, effortless nature was like a magnet, drawing her in. The more she thought about it, the more the sensation felt like something that could not be contained, something that could easily slip beyond the boundaries of her mission. Love was not part of the plan. It couldn't be. She had been sent here to observe, to learn, to report back. She was not supposed to get involved, not supposed to let anything change her purpose. But how could she ignore what she felt now? She glanced toward the door, half expecting him to walk back in, as if he had left because of some casual distraction. But the door stayed closed, and the people in the bar seemed no different than before. No one seemed to notice her sudden change. She forced herself to focus, to ground herself in the reality of the mission. She had a task. She had a reason for being here. She couldn't let this moment, this brief connection, derail everything. Yet even as she repeated that to herself, her eyes scanned the room, searching for some sign of him. She didn't even know his name. What did he do for a living? Was he even aware of what had just transpired between them? Was she making it up in her head? The warmth in her chest refused to dissipate, continuing to beat in her like a pulse, an undeniable rhythm that kept her connected to the moment. Time passed, and she continued to sit there, her drink untouched. The night seemed to drag on, each minute stretching longer than the last. But it wasn't the clock that kept her attention. It was the feeling of something missing, something incomplete. Her thoughts kept circling back to him, to that brief interaction. She couldn't let go of the question that had settled into her mind. Had he felt it too? Was it possible for him to feel what she felt? Humans didn't always show their true emotions. She had learned that much from the way they spoke in half-truths, the way they guarded themselves behind masks of politeness. But surely something had passed between them. The way his eyes lingered on hers, the way his smile reached his eyes, the subtle shift in his posture when they first spoke. There had to be more than just a casual conversation. She didn't know how to read it, but she could sense it. At some point, the bartender moved to refill her glass, but she waved him off. The drink no longer mattered. Nothing about the scene around her held any interest. Her thoughts were entirely consumed by him. She didn't know how long she sat there in the quiet tension, but eventually she felt the cool draft of the door opening behind her. Her heart skipped a beat. Without even looking, she knew who it was. She could feel his presence before she even heard the footsteps. She didn't turn around, though. Not yet. Instead, she kept her eyes fixed on the counter, willing herself to stay calm, to stay composed. He walked past her, just close enough that she could hear his footsteps falter for a second. He must have realized she was still sitting there. And then, without warning, he stopped. "Hey." His voice was soft, almost like a question. She glanced up, her pulse quickening. There he was again, standing just a few feet away, looking down at her with that familiar warmth. His eyes were slightly narrowed, as if searching for something, but it was hard to read. "Didn't expect to see you still here," he said, a faint chuckle in his tone. She blinked, unsure of how to respond. "I didn't expect to see you either." He smiled, but there was something more to it this time, something tentative. He shifted from foot to foot, and for a moment, she wondered if he was going to leave again. But then he spoke. "You mind if I sit down?" Her heart seemed to stop for a moment. It wasn't just a casual question. There was a weight to it now, a deeper implication she couldn't quite grasp. She nodded, clearing her throat. "Of course." He slid into the seat beside her, and for a long moment, neither of them said anything. There was an unspoken tension in the air, the same kind of quiet that had filled the room before he had left. But now, it felt heavier, as if the space between them had somehow become charged. He didn't look at her right away, instead glancing at the counter, fiddling with his drink. "I wasn't sure if I should come back," he admitted, his voice quieter now. "I felt like I might have said something weird. I didn't want to make you uncomfortable." She looked at him, the soft glow of the bar lights casting shadows across his face. There was sincerity in his words, and for a brief moment she saw a glimpse of something vulnerable behind the casual exterior. "You didn't," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I just wasn't sure if I should have said anything either." His gaze met hers, and the air between them seemed to thicken again. She couldn't look away. Something was happening, something neither of them fully understood, but both of them could feel. And just as she was about to speak again, the door opened once more, this time with a sharpness that seemed to interrupt the moment, pulling them both out of whatever fragile connection had been forming. She turned instinctively and saw the outline of someone she didn't recognize standing in the doorway. Her heart, once again, began to race. The door swung open with a creak, and the figure standing there seemed to freeze in place, silhouetted against the dim light outside. The bar suddenly felt colder, like the air itself had shifted. She could feel the weight of the stranger's gaze on her, sharp and unyielding, even from across the room. Her heartbeat quickened, but not in the same way it had when he had approached her. This was different, an unsettling, almost predatory kind of feeling. She turned her head slightly to see him, but her mind was already racing. There was something about the way he moved, the way his eyes scanned the room, that sent a chill running down her spine. He wasn't like the others here, not at all. There was an intensity to him, an energy that felt out of place in a casual setting like this one. And as his eyes met hers, she felt her stomach tighten, her breath catching in her throat. It wasn't a look of recognition, but something else entirely, something darker. She wasn't sure what made her react first, whether it was the sudden shift in the atmosphere or the way her companion beside her tensed up, but she instinctively knew something was wrong. The man at the door wasn't just another patron. He was here for a reason, and that reason had to do with her. The man from the doorway took a step inside, his boots clicking against the floor with an eerie finality. The noise cut through the low murmur of conversations like a blade, and for a moment it felt as if everything else had ceased to exist. The bartender had gone silent, a flicker of wariness in his eyes as he looked toward the newcomer. Even the music in the background seemed to fade into the shadows. The stranger's gaze never left her. She could feel the weight of it, sharp and calculating, as though he was studying her every move. The intensity of his stare made her skin prickle, and for the first time in what felt like ages, she felt a raw, undeniable sense of fear creeping in. She wanted to speak, to ask who he was, but the words felt heavy in her mouth. She could barely focus, the pulse in her ears drowning out everything else as her mind whirred with questions. What did he want? Why was he looking at her like that? And why did it feel like he knew exactly who she was? It was then that she realized he wasn't just looking at her. He was looking through her. There was an almost predatory air about him, like he could see something in her that no one else could. Something hidden beneath the surface. Something alien. Is everything okay? The voice beside her was a sudden break in her thoughts. It was him, the man she'd been talking to. His voice was low, filled with concern, but there was also a hint of something else. He had noticed, too. She swallowed, trying to push the knot in her throat down, and slowly turned her head back to him. His face was etched with a subtle anxiety now, and his eyes flicked toward the stranger, his posture shifting uneasily. It was as if, in that moment, both of them recognized that something was about to happen, something neither of them could control. She opened her mouth to say something, anything, but the words didn't come. Instead, all that escaped was a breathless whisper. He knows. The tension in the air thickened, pressing down on her chest. She could feel it now, the pull of his gaze like an invisible thread. It was like he was drawing closer to her with every breath, and her heart was racing as if it were trying to keep up. As the stranger closed the distance between them, she felt something shift. It wasn't just fear, it was something deeper, something primal that screamed at her to get out of there, to run. But she couldn't. Her body felt frozen in place, her mind scrambling to process everything that was happening. He was standing right in front of them now. She could smell him, an odd mixture of something metallic and the faintest trace of sulfur. It wasn't human, not at all. Her instincts were on high alert, and every part of her was screaming for her to move, to flee. But she couldn't tear her eyes away. There was something about him that held her in place, a magnetic force that kept her rooted to the spot. The man beside her shifted again, clearly nervous now, but still unsure of what to do. His hand hovered near his pocket, where she assumed he might have a weapon of some sort. He wasn't a fighter, she could tell that much, but he was trying to protect her. I don't know who you are, but you need to leave, he said, his voice steady, but with a hint of trembling. The stranger smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was a twisted thing, barely a curve of the lips, filled with cold amusement. You should be more careful about who you talk to, he said, his voice low and smooth, carrying a venomous edge that made her skin crawl. She's not who you think she is. The man beside her stiffened, clearly caught off guard. What are you talking about? The stranger's eyes flicked to her, and she could feel the weight of his gaze again. I know what you are, and I know why you're here. Her heart lurched in her chest. He knew. He knew who she was. But how? The confusion in her mind only deepened as she tried to process the words. She wasn't just a visitor. She wasn't just someone passing through. There was something about her, about what she was, that had drawn this man's attention. Something she hadn't yet fully understood herself. And then, in an instant, she realized it. It wasn't just about her. It was about them. Both of them, her and the man beside her. The connection they shared, the feeling that had sparked between them, wasn't just chance. It was something much more dangerous. She turned to him, her eyes wide, and saw the same realization dawn in his expression. They were in this together. But whatever was coming, whatever the stranger wanted, it would involve them both. The stranger's smile widened, as if he could hear the thoughts running through her head. "I think it's time we had a conversation," he said, his voice cold, final. And before she could react, he stepped closer, and the room seemed to close in around them. The stranger stepped closer, his eyes never leaving hers. The tension between them thickened, as though the very air had solidified into something dense and suffocating. He was right there, standing so close that she could feel the heat radiating off him. But it wasn't warmth. It was something darker, more unsettling, like the presence of a predator in the room. Her pulse was racing now, her heart pounding in her chest as if it were trying to escape. And yet, in the midst of all this, a strange thought flickered through her mind. He's not the only one watching us. The feeling hit her like a cold wave, washing over her from the inside out. It was subtle at first, just a slight sense that something was off, like a ripple in the atmosphere. But as the seconds stretched on, the sensation grew stronger. She wasn't alone in this room anymore. The strange weight of the stranger's gaze felt lighter, almost insignificant compared to the overwhelming presence now closing in around her. She tried to look around the room, but it felt as though the shadows themselves were shifting, moving in on her. She couldn't pinpoint where it was coming from, but she felt it. Someone else was there, watching, waiting. Then, a voice rang out from the back of the bar, cutting through the thickening tension. It was familiar. It was his. "Get away from her," the man beside her said, his voice strained but laced with a strange kind of finality. The stranger's lips curled into a smile, but it wasn't a smile that made her feel any better. It was the smile of someone who already knew the outcome of a game. "You should have stayed out of this," the stranger murmured, his voice lowering to a menacing growl. Before the man could respond, the door to the bar slammed open once more, so hard the wood seemed to rattle in its frame. The sudden noise sent a jolt through her, and she instinctively looked toward the entrance. The figure that stepped inside this time was unlike anything she had ever seen. Cloaked in shadow, with a hood that obscured most of its features, it moved with a grace that seemed unnatural. The room went silent. Even the stranger, who had been so certain of his position, seemed to hesitate, his eyes flicking between her and the newcomer. The man beside her, too, froze, his muscles tense as he instinctively shifted closer to her, as if to protect her from whatever this new figure might be. But she could tell, even from her position, that he wasn't ready for what was about to unfold. The cloaked figure stepped forward slowly, every movement deliberate, and the air seemed to grow colder with each step. She could feel the eyes of the room on it, some curious, some fearful. But there was no question. This presence was different. This was not just a person. The cloaked figure stopped a few paces from the stranger, who had finally broken his gaze from her. For a brief moment, she thought she saw a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. The shadows seemed to gather around the figure, swirling like smoke, and for the first time, she realized just how small she had felt in comparison to the power emanating from the cloaked presence. The figure lifted a hand, and the room seemed to hold its breath. "You shouldn't be here," the figure said, its voice cold, hollow, like it was coming from some place beyond human comprehension. The stranger's expression darkened, but there was no anger in his eyes. No, there was something worse. Something resigned. You don't know who you're dealing with. The figure tilted its head slightly, the shadows shifting in a way that made it seem even more otherworldly. I know exactly who you are, it said, its voice echoing slightly, as though it carried more weight than a mere mortal voice ever could. And you will not have her. At those words, something in her stomach twisted. She had no idea what was happening, but she could feel the air change again, this time with an intensity that left her dizzy. She turned to the man beside her, whose face had gone pale. What? What's going on? Who are they? His eyes flicked to her, panic creeping into his expression. You have to trust me. I'll explain later. But we need to leave now. But before she could even process the urgency in his voice, the cloaked figure moved again. The air crackled as though the very space between them had been stretched thin. A pulse of energy slammed into her, making her vision blur for a split second. When it cleared, she found herself standing at the edge of the room, as if the figure had willed her to move without her consent. The stranger's eyes narrowed, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of real frustration cross his face. You don't get to take her. The cloaked figure didn't respond immediately. Instead, it raised its other hand, the shadows swirling like living tendrils, almost like they were searching for something. She could feel the pressure building, as if the very air itself was about to snap. Her breath came in short bursts, her body tense with anticipation. And then suddenly the world shuddered. A burst of energy, so powerful it felt like a physical blow, sent everyone in the room stumbling backward. The force of it made the air taste metallic, and she could feel her limbs go numb, as though her body had been pulled into a different reality for just a moment. Her vision wavered, and for the briefest of moments, she thought she saw a flicker of someone behind the cloaked figure. It was a face. Not the face of the figure standing before her, but someone else entirely. Someone she knew. But before she could make sense of it, the feeling passed, leaving her dizzy and disoriented. The stranger was still there, but now his expression was one of pure anger. His fists clenched as if trying to hold on to something. The man beside her was trying to keep his balance, his hand gripping the counter as though it were the only thing anchoring him to reality. What was that? She gasped, barely able to speak through the sudden wave of dizziness. The cloaked figure stepped back, its eyes locked onto her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. It's too late, it whispered, the shadows around it deepening. The threads are already tangled. And in that moment, she understood they weren't just here for her. They were here for something much bigger. Something that neither she nor anyone in this room was prepared for. As she tried to steady herself, she realized the one thing that terrified her most. There was no way out of this. The game had begun, and she was already trapped in the middle of it. The room was still spinning as she tried to steady herself against the bar, her hand trembling as it gripped the edge. The chaos in the air was palpable electric, thick with tension, and it felt like the walls themselves were closing in. She could hear her own heart pounding in her chest, drowning out everything else as the figures before her seemed to blur into shadows. Every breath felt too shallow, every moment too stretched, and yet nothing made sense. Nothing but one truth, glaring and undeniable. Everything had changed in an instant. Cloaked figure moved again, its steps measured, slow and deliberate. There was no urgency in its actions, only the weight of inevitability. It was as if it knew exactly how everything would unfold, like it had seen this moment 1,000 times before. The stranger, on the other hand, was no longer smiling. His features were twisted with frustration, with a fury that seemed to surge beneath the surface, ready to explode. Enough! The stranger's voice cracked through the thick air like a whip, sharp and commanding. He reached for something, his hands trembling as if he were unsure of his next move. The cloaked figure's gaze was unwavering, but there was something in its silence that unsettled her even more. It wasn't just watching them. It was waiting. Then, without warning, a bright flash of light exploded from the figure's outstretched hand, a burst of energy so powerful that the room seemed to lurch. She was thrown backward, her vision swimming as the world around her blurred into white-hot intensity. The light collided with the stranger, knocking him off his feet with a force that sent him crashing into the far wall. Everything went silent. For a moment, she thought she had lost consciousness. But when her eyes fluttered open again, the world was still dark, the room a haze of shadow and light. She tried to focus, but the ringing in her ears made it difficult to hear anything. All she could make out were shapes moving in the shadows, shapes that looked eerily familiar, as though they were watching her from the edges of her mind. The stranger, he was still there. She could see him now, rising to his feet slowly, his face twisted with determination. He shook off the dust and debris, his eyes narrowing as he looked back at the cloaked figure. "You think that's enough to stop me?" he spat, his voice hoarse but filled with a terrifying resolve. The cloaked figure's silence was deafening. Then, in a move so swift it was almost imperceptible, it reached out again. This time, the shadows didn't just move. They collapsed in on themselves, swirling like a storm, a vortex pulling everything into its center. The air itself seemed to freeze, as though time had paused in that very moment. She gasped, her body reacting instinctively as the pressure intensified. But just as it seemed like the end, something else happened, something she didn't expect. A crackling sound, low and distant, filled the space, like the first rumblings of thunder before a storm. The ground beneath her feet seemed to tremble. The cloaked figure froze, its head jerking toward the source of the sound, its posture suddenly stiffening with an unfamiliar tension. And that's when she saw it. A figure, tall, imposing, emerged from the shadows, stepping into the bar with a calm that defied the chaos. It was a man, but not one she had ever seen before. He was dressed in dark, sleek armor, his eyes glowing faintly with an unnatural light. His presence was enough to make the entire room fall into a strange kind of stillness, as if the very air was holding its breath. The cloaked figure flinched, something shifting in its stance, but it said nothing. The man's gaze was cold, calculating, but locked onto the cloaked figure with an intensity that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. "You shouldn't have come here," the armored man said, his voice low, carrying a weight of authority that sent a shiver down her spine. His eyes flicked briefly to her, then back to the cloaked figure. "This doesn't concern you." The cloaked figure's silence was no longer passive. It was as if it was gathering its strength, preparing for something more. The air in the room crackled again, and she could feel the energy building, pressing against her chest. "You don't understand," the cloaked figure said at last, its voice now less ethereal, more human. "It's already begun. The threads are tangled, and there's no going back. She is the key. She always has been." The armored man's expression darkened, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, something she couldn't quite place, but it was unmistakable. He stepped forward, his movements precise, deliberate. "You were warned. You've overstepped." The cloaked figure's lips curled into something that could almost be mistaken for a smile. "You cannot protect her." Not from this. The tension in the room built to a breaking point. She could feel the conflict rising, the atmosphere around them so thick with uncertainty that it made her dizzy. There were so many questions, so many things she didn't understand. But there was one truth that she could no longer ignore. Everything had led to this. She wasn't just a pawn in some larger game, she was the game. Her chest tightened as she looked between the two figures, trying to make sense of it all. The cloaked figure, who seemed to know more about her than she ever could, and the armored man, who was equally mysterious. What did they want with her? What had they meant by "she is the key"? Without warning, the armored man surged forward, faster than she could process, his hand reaching out toward the cloaked figure. But just as he was within arm's reach, the figure reacted. The shadows roared to life, stretching and twisting around it like an explosion of dark matter, pushing the armored man back with a force so intense it cracked the floor beneath him. And then, in that split second of chaos, she saw something that made her blood run cold. The armored man's mask, the one that had covered his face, fell away. And what she saw underneath made everything fall into place. It was him, the man who had been talking to her earlier, the one who had seemed so ordinary, but now, seeing him like this, she realized that he was no ordinary man at all. He wasn't just trying to protect her. He was part of this conflict. And everything, every word, and every gesture had been a part of his plan. The realization hit her hard, but before she could react, the cloaked figure lunged, its hands reaching for her, and she could feel the ground beneath her slipping away. But as the figure touched her, she felt something new. Power, a raw, uncontained force pulsing through her, flooding her senses. She had no idea what it was, but she knew, deep down, it was her power. And in that moment, she realized she had always been the one pulling the strings. The world around her erupted into light and shadow, and she knew that everything was about to change. The world around her cracked open, the shadows swirling like an endless storm, and everything she thought she knew about herself, about them, about what was happening began to shatter. The feeling was overwhelming, too much to comprehend in that instant, as if the very fabric of reality itself was unraveling. For a split second, she didn't know whether she was falling or rising. The energy, her energy, surged through her with a force so intense she couldn't breathe. She was both everywhere and nowhere, connected to everything in the room, yet completely separate from it all. She could hear the clash of voices, some distant, some close, but they didn't make sense anymore. The sound of the armored man's voice, now frantic, was nothing more than a dull hum in the background, as though it was far, far away. The cloaked figure had been relentless, its presence suffocating, but now it was faltering, uncertain, its control slipping as her newfound power radiated outward. It was as though she had become a beacon, a source of light in the heart of the storm, and in that moment, she understood what the cloaked figure had meant. The threads were tangled, yes, but they had been tangled by her. All of it, every choice she had made, every action that had led her to this point, had been a part of a much larger design. A design she had always been a part of, but had never understood. She wasn't just caught in the web of others. She was the web itself. The realization hit her with the force of 1,000 lightning strikes. Her power, her ability to shift reality, to bend the very energy around her had always been there. It was never something she had to find. It had been inside her all along, buried beneath layers of fear and doubt, waiting for the right moment to awaken. Her hands trembled as she reached up to steady herself, to regain control of her body. The energy still pulsed within her, raw and untamed, but now she could feel the shift. The shadows around her were no longer threatening. They were part of her. The dark figure in front of her, the one who had been pulling the strings, was losing its grip. The balance was tipping. The armored man had recovered, but there was no victory in his eyes anymore. There was only a sense of recognition. Something had clicked. Whatever had happened just now, whatever this power was, he knew it meant the end of whatever had brought them here. He knew it was over. She took a slow step forward, her voice steady despite the chaos inside her. "You wanted to use me, didn't you?" she said, her words echoing through the room. "All of this, it was for your plan, your war." The cloaked figure recoiled, but she could see it now. There was no terror in its gaze, only something darker. Resignation. It's always been the plan. The voice was softer now, almost tired. "From the beginning, you were never meant to be a victim. You were meant to be a weapon." A weapon. The word hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. She had always wondered why things felt out of place, why the world never seemed to fit her. Now, it was all clear. The power, the connection, the strange pull she had felt throughout her life. It had all been part of something larger, a design she couldn't even begin to understand. And yet, standing here, in the heart of the storm, she could feel that power aligning with her own will. She wasn't just part of their plan anymore. She was the one rewriting it. The armored man stepped closer, his eyes locked on hers. There was no question now. He had seen it too. She was no longer a tool. She was something more. "You're the key," he whispered, almost in awe. "You always were. But you didn't have to choose their path. You can choose your own." The words sank deep into her, filling the empty space that had been left by the fear and confusion. She had always been trapped in the belief that her destiny had been set, that she had no choice but to follow the path laid before her. But now, standing on the edge of everything, she realized that she was the one who had the power to choose. It wasn't about what others had planned for her. It was about what she was willing to create. The cloaked figure stirred, but it was too late. The shadows around it began to dissipate, unraveling like smoke in the wind. The energy that had once been so suffocating was now slipping through her fingers like sand, its grip loosening as she took control. The figure tried to fight, to push against the tide, but there was no longer any fight left in it. It was a relic of the past, a dying echo of a plan that had already crumbled. With a final, desperate cry, the cloaked figure collapsed into nothingness, vanishing like a dream, fading at the dawn. The energy in the room shifted once more, and for the first time, the oppressive weight that had hung over her for so long finally lifted. She was free. But freedom was not something that came without consequences. As the last of the figure's presence dissolved into the air, the room fell into a stunned silence. The armored man was still there, watching her, but now she could see the weight in his gaze, the understanding, the fear. "I didn't want this for you," he said, his voice quiet. "None of this. It was always meant to be a test, to see if you were ready. But now," he paused, his words faltering, "now you have to decide what comes next. The power, the threads, they're yours now. You control them." She looked at him, really looked at him, and for the first time, she saw the truth of his words. He wasn't her enemy. He was part of this complex, twisted web, just like she had been. But unlike her, he had been lost in the game. Now, she could see the difference between them. He had always believed in someone else's vision, while she was finally seeing her own. "You're right," she said softly, taking a steadying breath. I control it now, and I'm not going to be anyone's weapon. The weight of her decisions settled over her. It wasn't just about power, it was about choice, about understanding that whatever happened next, she was the one who would shape it. There was no more fear, no more hesitation. The world was waiting for her to create something new. The armored man nodded, stepping back slightly. I've served my purpose. You know what you have to do. She nodded, her gaze shifting to the shattered remnants of the room, the remnants of everything that had brought her here. Her mind raced with possibilities. What would she do now with the threads of fate in her hands? There were no more answers, only questions. But one thing was clear. The story she would write would be her own. And as she stood there, surrounded by the aftermath of everything that had just happened, she realized something else. This wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. The power, the choices, the new path, everything lay ahead of her. She would rebuild, but this time it would be her world, her rules. And with that, she stepped forward, leaving the past behind and embracing the future she was now free to create. The world waited, and she was ready to shape it.